everyone. How was lunch? Yeah? I am so excited for this conversation. I think it's going to be a real treat. The panelists that are going to come up here are just some of the most incredible friends that I have, but also just so knowledgeable in all things climate storytelling. So, the past 2 days, we've been talking a lot about storytelling, world building, and really what we can do within our own spheres of influence to get people to care about climate using the power of story. And this specific panel is going to be talking about the ethics behind that. We're going to be answering the question of what is ethical climate storytelling? So before we get into the meat of the conversation, I'll introduce our incredible panelists. First up, we have environmental activist, animator, and founder, Maya Penn, environmental educator and creator of Queer Bound Vegan, Isaias Hernandez, and environmental activist and creator of Brown Girl Green, Kristy Drutman. You all are killing it, by the way. I love the arrangement of outfits, and it's just personality pieces all around. So before we get into our conversation, I would love to give y'all the opportunity to introduce yourselves and let the audience know who you are, what you do, and how you're approaching this conversation in regards to ethical climate storytelling. So I'll start with Maya.
Thank you so much, Wawa, and I'm so honored and excited to be here. My name is Maya Penn. I am a 22-year-old environmental activist. I am an animator, filmmaker, and Simon Schuster author, as well as a 3-time TED Talk speaker. I'm someone who is also a sustainability consultant. I've worked with Fortune 500 companies and startups and everything in between, on their sustainability and ESG journey. And I'm also someone who has really seen and utilized the power of animation for both environmental and social good. I have my own production company, and in 2016, during the Obama administration, I was commissioned to animate the opening of the first ever digital report presented to Congress, which was to get an American Museum of Women's History built in Washington. And as of 2021, that legislation was passed through the Senate, so that's something I'm really excited about. And I really am so excited for this panel because I think it's something that's so crucial as more people are shifting their attention to how they can utilize this medium to make a difference. So,
Isaias.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me. And my name is Isaias Hernandez. I am an environmental educator at first and a content creator online as Queer Brown Vegan. I don't always talk about veganism, but a lot of my work is focused on environmental justice and localization. I think for me, education has been such a powerful tool to be able to identify the current power imbalances in these systems. And I think for me, no single child or no single adult, should be ignored or neglected. Equitable environmental education that truly covers the reasons why we are in this ecological crisis. And so a lot of my work focuses on working with small organizations, institutions, and individuals to kind of push out this introductory form of environmentalism so people have the tools and to be able to educate others around them.
And hi everyone, my name is Kristy Drutman. I am a Jewish and Filipina environmental media host and storyteller of my platform, Brown Girl Green. And I am also a consultant on sustainability, social media, and justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion for environmental companies and organizations. I'm really passionate about the intersections between justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion and solutions to the climate crisis. I also am the founder of the Green Jobs Board, which is now an online media platform using social media to bring more green job employment opportunities to especially young people of color. Most of my work is centered around how do we bring not only more Black, Indigenous, and people of color into the room, but how do we give them roles and storytelling opportunities that actually centers their voices and their experiences and gives them the resources to empower themselves and their communities to make a difference. Thank you.
Amazing. I'm constantly inspired by all three of you, and I'm so excited to hear your viewpoints here today. So to really ground this conversation, I think it's important for us to first define what ethical climate storytelling is. I think all of us have a grasp of what climate storytelling is, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what ethical climate storytelling is, how you incorporate it in your work, and where you're seeing it done well. So we can start with whoever wants to start.
I mean, I guess I can go ahead and start. For me, ethical climate storytelling is really about, calling in, more marginalized voices, making sure that, storytelling, when we're really zeroing in on these crucial topics within climate, within sustainability, that we're, really centering the voices that need to be heard, both behind the scenes and on camera. And, it's really crucial in that sense because of how interconnected environmental and climate issues are with a myriad of other social and world issues in general, also really understanding and not siloing, all of these different topics as well. I think it's humanizing these stories. It's about accessibility to information, diversifying the scheme of who's telling these stories, and also, for me, the way that I incorporate that into my own work, I'm very passionate, like everyone else is on this panel, about environmental justice, about centering the voices of Black, brown, and indigenous people and other marginalized communities. I'm really passionate about showing the different connections between various issues within various industries and communities around the world, and how they all interconnect and overlap with each other, and really understanding and highlighting those underserved issues within the environmental and climate space, because we need every puzzle piece, together to really make a true impact.
And it's all about telling the full story, right? It's not fictitious in having a broad range of people involved in the storytelling process, in the stories that are being told, and who is helping to tell that story and with different forms of media. So I think that's a really, really important part that you highlighted there. So Isaias, would you like to answer this as well?
Yeah, I would say, to me, ethical climate storytelling really gets at talking about the raw oppression of not just the individuals that has gone through something traumatic, but it talks about communities, it talks about multi-species of humans, animals, living, non-living systems that in it itself our hearts have been attached to in this planet. And I think for me, kind of as an educator, it really highlights on focusing on, first and foremost, indigenous wisdom, the indigenous communities. Number two, our cultural-based experiences, everyone here having culture itself. And then three, our lived experiences with place-based relationships in our biosystems, because I think that's for what a lot of us, our stories originate from, is where we were born, where our ancestors are from, what traditions were passed down onto us.
And for me, ethical climate storytelling comes down to framing and impact. So I would say the framing comes down to who's telling the story and who's the story about. I think that in some traditional recent, we're going to talk about this more on the panel, but like previous mainstream environmental narratives and storytelling was focused on a savior narrative, basically replicating some forms of colonialism in some ways, where it's like you would see some like white explorer man go into these, other countries and be like, look at these indigenous people, and they're doing these amazing things to save the planet. But it was very framed as like they're these victims that maybe were able to help their community, and then he's coming in as like this like third-party observer and coming up with a solution for them, or like creating the framing that's not necessarily bringing them into the storytelling process or development process of actually creating that piece. And I've seen that time and time again, where the communities that are most marginalized aren't necessarily given the same types of resources to make their own films, to make their own stories. So a lot of times it is a collaborative process with people who do have power and resources, but that can restrict, some of the ethics and framing that goes along with that storytelling. And so when that happens, that can actually have material impacts on the way that story is told and how people interpret where those resources need to go, who gets those resources, which communities do and don't get prioritized. And I think stories can be the difference between life and death for certain communities. And so when I think about ethical storytelling, I think it's about people being accountable to that process and understanding that the way in which you tell the story and who's involved in the process from start to finish and afterwards, that accountability is so critical.
It's so critical. And I have had such a similar experience to you of growing up. My family's from Kenya. So a lot of the representation I would see of specifically my tribe as a Kikuyu woman was in, no shade, National Geographic. I know times have changed, but was seeing this like objective white observer telling our stories, but we were never in a situation in which I was seeing stories where we were actually at the forefront and talking about our own experiences from this firsthand expertise, right? We have this unique expertise of our lived experiences because we know them best. So we've talked a little bit about this transition that we've seen in which just in our lifetime, the ways in which climate is being told is changing. We are seeing, even with you all being pioneers and centering your own voices in the way that you're communicating your own stories and then letting your audiences, be guided by that. I love to know about this transition, how you've seen it happen and where you think it's coming from.
I would say that what I've seen is that it's ethical climate storytelling is rejecting uniformity and mediocrity, right? I think that for so long there was this idea of this perfectionism of like the rhetoric of no one's talking about this, so I'm going to make a film about it and expose everything. And I think there is some truth to that, of course, but there's also the other truth of like there's literally indigenous communities have been saying this for decades about our ecological crisis and weren't given the same amplification platforms, resources to be creating these series. And I think a lot about like Gather, that talks a lot about seed sovereignty and like food sovereignty and these concepts that have often been hijacked in the dominant environmental movement. And I think for me, like, seeing the diversity in ethical climate storytelling to me has really pushed people to understand that we are much more than our trauma, because a lot of the times what was focused in environmental leader discourse and heroism is let's talk first about your trauma. And I think that so many people are so tired of being re-traumatized that they don't feel alive when they talk about their own struggle anymore because they've had to overcome that. And I think it's more about what are the family relationships that you have with your community, the other things that are alchemizing during that experience that truly matter, not just the victim narrative that was put out there when you were 10 years old, 13, 18, whatever that you may have experienced.
For sure. We are so much more than our traumas, and it's important that the stories that are being reflected of our experiences understand us in our full capacities. So, Kristy, what's your answer to this question?
Yeah, I mean, with Brown Girl Green, I started it in 2017, and, I was putting out a lot of episodes and even trying to reach out to some pretty big environmental organizations to try to collaborate with me, and it was crickets. I didn't hear anything from people. So I kept grinding for several years, and I think definitely with like the wake during the pandemic of people waking up to racial injustice in this country, I was getting hit up left and right when that started happening. Then people were like, oh, I kept you on the periphery, and now I want to give you resources. And for me, it's not like I felt bitter about that. I think it was really like a side eye, you know what I mean? Where I'm like, well, how are you actually lining up your resources now in the long term to your justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion commitments? It can't just be this one-time thing where now, you want me to be the token brown girl in your panels, the token brown girl in your ad campaigns for your brands. And I had to talk about that. I said, well, what are your commitments? What were you doing before all this happened? But I saw that shift started happening where those of us here, like we all ended up getting a lot more resources and attention for our intersectional work, even though we had been doing it for years. And for me, the way I've seen the shift is actual tangible resources, seeing incubators for intersectional climate storytelling, seeing philanthropies actually putting money behind it, and companies and brands actually understanding that they can't just be sustainable anymore. They also have to think about being ethical and care about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion if they're going to remain relevant to young audiences.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing you really lay out is that ethical climate storytelling really is this ethical ecosystem.
Yeah.
It's not just in the stories that are being told. It's not just in the crew. It's where the funds are coming from.
Exactly.
And whether or not that funds are intentionally being put out there for ethical climate storytelling from communities themselves to tell their own stories. So I'd like to pivot a little bit to you, Maya. You are a animator, founder, and a filmmaker. So I'd love to know, in regards to this transition that we're talking about, have you seen that transition happen in regards to the behind the scenes work? Are you seeing this transition of the stories, more diverse stories being told? Is that reflected on what people don't see on screen?
So I think what's really interesting about that is, I'm someone who's been an environmental activist since 2008 when I was 8 years old. So I've technically now been doing this for 14 years, which is kind of crazy to think about. And I've seen the shift. But the thing that's really interesting is, of course, people are looking at the industry leaders, so to speak, and the corporations that are calling these people in. But a lot of that shift has been purely community driven because the playing field has been in some ways, a little bit leveled. There's a little bit of an extra, step up to start being able to break in. You have, social media and the internet, and you have all these different platforms to be able to share your work that, more marginalized creators, so many Black, brown, and indigenous, creatives and directors and writers and animators and artists and filmmakers, are now having an opportunity to kind of call their own shots. There's crowdfunding. There's so many unique and unprecedented opportunities for people to be able to independently produce their own work. And I think that that's been the way that so many of the the voices in the space that are making it into the space and are having their work seen on a larger and a more global scale. I think that's the way that it's happened. It's been so purely community driven, and now the industry is having to catch up with that, and they're having to meet those creators because they've seen, okay, well, nothing's really, going to be stopping them. Of course, we need more resources, in these communities. We need more opportunities. There need to be more, more access to, support and funds and mentorship and everything under the sun. But at the end of the day, that's still not stopping people from telling their stories in a way that's authentic. And I think that's something that's, again, it's a testament to the power of the community as well. And even accessibility to information on how to do these crafts, on accessibility to software and technology that enables us. It's all of this has evolved so much. And I think that it has, enabled more marginalized storytellers to be able to, bring that forward, and I think that's really awesome to see.
So I'd love to ask Isaias and Kristy this question because I think yesterday when you asked a question, Isaias, you had talked about your experience, or both of y'all's experience, going to Asia this past month, Southeast Asia, specifically, I believe the Philippines and Cambodia, and your venture as first-time filmmakers and kind of taking that into your own hands. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that experience and perhaps some advice for people in the audience that might be interested in pursuing something similar but don't know where to start as first-timers.
Yeah, I mean, just to run it down a bit quickly, basically, I really wanted to produce some form of content or series focused on sustainable fashion, especially for young women my age. A big issue that we face is about fast fashion. And so I really wanted to create a series on sustainable fashion from the perspective of, a Gen Z millennial cusper on what does sustainable fashion really mean? What does that look like? And I had the opportunity through my platform on Brown Girl Green with a company and a brand that I really admire called Tonlé. The idea started budding, how do we move beyond just an advertisement to actually thinking about a full-on series where we're actually getting to document and show upcycled textile waste being turned into mainstream fashion pieces. And so I was really inspired to want to make my first ever series that was professionally filmed and produced. And again, most of my experience is in storytelling and using social media for storytelling. That's my platform. But I was I want to have an even bigger impact. And unfortunately, social media is being viewed as, this standard for content creation and storytelling, but there is still that element of like wanting something more professionally produced. And so we began our journey traveling to Cambodia this past month, working with this brand to think about that, telling that story. We had an entire Cambodian filmmaking crew. But again, like we only had a limited budget because we are so new to all of this that we just literally don't know exactly like how you secure that type of funding. How do you produce a docu-series? Like these are things that like we're literally having to Google on the internet because we didn't grow up with access to that. And so for me, it's been a lot of like self-teaching. And you know, we had mentors and people who understand the media space who have helped us out with making a proposal, who helped us out with thinking about, you know, storyboarding, and convinced us to make a trailer since we had limited resources. And so, you know, we're going to be finishing the trailer this summer to, you know, get more sponsors and to try to, you know, expand our impact with it. But it was such a big process for us as people who have used social media as our way and outlet to be able to educate folks. But then when it came into the more traditional filmmaking space, it did feel like I was just keeping my head right above water, where it was like, you know, I understand the intersectional climate story. We do have that cool factor that was discussed yesterday because we inherently get how to make things cool. Like we know how to tell those stories.
Have the superpower.
We got that superpower, but I think in terms of like the funding and the resources and planning that out, we're so new to that. So I'll let Isaias add on to that.
Yeah, and I would say like, you know, like many other people in the panels that we've seen is like perhaps their study or their specific career wasn't in the environmental sector. And like for both of us, it's like we both did environmental science at Berkeley. And it's like, you know, for me as an educator, I've always been so passionate about education. And obviously fashion is so intersected with land, culture, like people, animals. Like these are all things that everyone in different industries is essentially an environmentalist, whether you see that or not. And I think that as independent environmental media creators, something that we, you know, constantly face is, you know, the scalability of your work. Like how are you scaling your work? How are you making sure that your content is high quality? That means to invest in a team, investing in cameras, investing in phones. And then you realize like there's a lot of gaps where it's like, you know, even though I did the education route, like in high school, I took 1 year of film and I dropped out of that program and switched into digital imaging because I told myself I don't want to do film, and this was so hard to be in this film industry. And so that turned me off at a very young age here in LA when I took that program, and going back to it of like, you know, not having to hold a film camera, but being behind the scenes, producing, writing things, like doing business relationships, like those things to me came more naturally. And so I think that it's more about like recognizing like what are your limits and what are the things that you can currently do to change that, rather than focusing on the fact of like I've been you know, I've had these barriers growing up, I've faced these types of oppression in these types of fields, and recognizing like yes, that really hurts, it does, but then you also need to recognize like, you know, if I don't do it now, then how am I going to open opportunities for other younger people, specifically people of color, who ask me these questions, and I'm like, well, that's a great question. Who can I point you to? And so I think it's more about like, you know, it's not just solely on like centering our narratives, but it's about like opening opportunities for other creatives internationally who don't have those experiences or may not be exposed or influenced to take initiative on that.
There's so much there that I love, and oh my goodness. So first thing, another component that I'm hearing you say is when it comes to ethical climate storytelling, it's very similar to this concept. You know, something that I'm hearing a lot in the audience and the questions and the panels is people talking about being a good ancestor, being a good steward for not just the people that you're in direct community with, right? Your friends, your family, and direct community, but even people that you don't know. So it's interesting because I think that part of ethical climate storytelling that you just talked about is making sure that the work that you're doing is making pathways for others, and that should be fundamentally integrated within the work that you're doing. Another thing is I want to make sure that there are a lot of movers and shakers here. Keep up to date with these three. Obviously, they're doing really great stuff. And then the other thing is I think another part that you were talking about was even if, as a newcomer, as someone like you were talking about, you didn't grow up in a circumstance where you were in close proximity to people that were in this world, in this industry. And yet, even though there were times where you felt like maybe this isn't for me, maybe this is too difficult, you still found your way to where you are now. So I think that's a testament to who you are, but that's also a testament of how important it is to persevere and get innovative with the different ways that you find support and funding. And it's so interesting because someone answered a question yesterday, I'm blanking on their name, and they talked about how when they started collaborating with brands because brands were the first ones that were more likely to take a chance rather than the studio. So I think that's a very interesting point, and that there was already that synergy, and they didn't even know that was stuff that y'all were already doing. So let's hop to the next question. And this is a quote that I have said before, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So it's not enough to simply tell climate stories. Representation for representation's sake is never the answer. What does that mean to you? Do you agree? Do you not?
I think what's really interesting about that is, honestly, there is so little representation to begin with. It's almost like, I agree, it's representation is one thing, but actual action is another thing, and I feel like that needs to be coupled. But then at the same time, we also can't sleep on, how important it is to tell people's stories, to share, how some of these issues impact certain communities, and, and also, too, I think that also speaks to the importance of, not only being represented, but also how that representation is facilitated, almost like how we've been talking about, like, do you have people who are behind the camera, who are in the editing room or the writing room, or or they're directing, that are from these communities, and that's going also to the, question we were just talking about, with my own production company. And it's interesting, I started working with a lot of nonprofits and brands, like Adobe, GoDaddy, doing a lot of projects around women's rights and sustainability and so on and so forth, Hulu. But, now I'm currently working on my own original animated short film, which is based off of a concept I originally premiered during one of my TED Talks that went viral worldwide and got translated into 38 different languages. And, now I have an opportunity as someone who's been, really working this pipeline myself. I'm at, a Savannah College of Art and Design. I've studied with them. I've done literally everything from writing to post-production to animating, storyboarding. And now I'm bringing on other, Black, brown, and indigenous artists, women and gender nonconforming artists and, disabled artists, and it's super awesome. And so now I'm able to help reach back and bring in a lot of the people who haven't been able to, really find their way in the industry or find their voice to, create this project, which is what I'm really excited about. So I think that, to your point of the quote, it's really important as how that representation is facilitated, because of course we talk about representation matters, but that doesn't just mean, on the screen, it also means behind the scenes, as well, because, even when we're talking about something that's fully centered on animals and plants, a lot of species and ecosystems have specific, significance to certain people. There are so many indigenous communities that have been protecting, the majority of the world's biodiversity, and they have their own specific
80%.
Knowledge. 80, exactly, and they have their own specific knowledge. I mean, there's so many different examples of this, but that's my take on it.
Right, and you're talking about behind the scenes and then also the implications. So after, you've packaged up some whatever type of media that you're putting forth, and it's, falling under this ethical climate storytelling, I think it's important also to focus on what are the viewers, what is the audience taking away from this, and what are the implications of that? Are people going to see something by you, Maya, and say, oh my goodness, there is this other Black woman that is telling these stories. Now I can reach out to you and get some advice, or now I know it's something that I can do because I have that representation. And also the implications of, whoa, this is providing some action steps integrated within this story. Now I can walk away from this and actually take some action in my community, in my personal life, in my workspace, whatever it might be. So what do y'all think about that quote?
Yeah, I mean, just building off of that, I would say that like representation is great to some extent. Like we were saying, there's already not that much of it, especially in the environmental storytelling space. So I think those of us, we all kind of know each other at this point, and we're all each other's support system. And so I think it is, again, it's like you can bring a bunch of people of color into like the room, but that doesn't mean they're gonna wanna stay. Like that you actually created the environment and culture for them to want to be there. I've had so many people who enter the impact space and then want to leave because they're like, I'm experiencing all these microaggressions. I don't even feel like my voice or my work matters and is valued. And again, like people in this industry may just say, well, you're replaceable, we could find someone else. But then it's like at the end of the day, then how are you going to actually make those commitments to your justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion commitments, right? And so there's a disconnect there. And so for me, I think it can't just be representation, it has to be also institutional change. This whole conference, we've been talking about institutional change for climate, carbon emissions, all these things, but it's like, where's the discussions around labor, about work culture, about human rights? I think that also equally needs to be discussed just as much as your net zero goals. And I think it's just not happening in sustainable companies to the extent it needs to be. And I know that from personal experience as a quote unquote influencer who's worked with many of these brands, they have the best sustainability commitments, but when it comes to the models they use or the stories they're telling about their brand, no one who looks like me. And then I'm like, okay, so why do you want to work with me then? And they're like, oh, because we love what you represent. And then it's like, what does that mean? And I'm like, if you really care about what I represent, then put the resources behind it to be accountable to that also.
Right. I'm good at personally, yes. I'm seeing the ticking time, and there's just so much in this conversation that I want us to hit. So climate doomism. I'll let one of you, Isaias, you made videos about this. I'll let one of you define what that is. But what role does nihilism, doomism, even apocalyptic themes have in climate storytelling? Is there a place for sensationalism in the way that we talk about climate?
You know, it's a really interesting thing because I think a lot of social media platforms are really good at perpetuating sensationalism now, especially TikTok, right? It's come under fire so many times where you see 0 to 7 second videos blowing up, have millions of views. I think with like climate doomism, like, and there's so many definitions out there, and I'm just like someone that's like how it's defined institutionally in some ways, like due to anthropogenic human-induced actions. There is no livable future in the future due to unsustainable practices, right? But there's so much to unpack within that term and like its meaning. But I would say that climate doomism and its role with popular media, I think that it needs to be carefully crafted and carefully designed if it's truly going to be talked about. And I think, you know, one thing I really reference, and I love this scholar's work, Vandana Shiva, is like the idea of like the disappearance of knowledge, the disappearance of people. And if we're not truly being careful of how we're talking about who's disappearing, whose narratives are being displaced, then in itself can kind of lead to really murky waters, because in itself you're saying that those people no longer exist or systematically eliminated from these things, and we've seen that happen a lot. So I'd say that climate doom for me, like I feel that it is really easier for certain people to cling on to that than to kind of reimagine the future. And I think that's a lot because a lot of us have been disconnected from local communities, local knowledge of who is our lifeline rather than online. Because I know at the end of the day too, even as a social media influencer, if there's something like a wildfire here or a flood, I'm not gonna go on a live stream and be like, help me everyone, I need your money. It's gonna be like, I need to check in with my neighbor to see, are they okay? Am I okay? How can we help each other? And that's something that's not talked about. And it is true, like we have become divided for certain reasons and a lot of harmful ideologies that have been put out there. And that's the biggest issue that we face today is like, how do we confront white supremacy? And I think for me, dismantling white supremacy is a form of environmentalism. Like we cannot separate the two.
So on that point, a film that has all the rage in the environmental space and even outside the environmental space, which is really exciting, is don't look up. And a critique that I heard quite a bit from within the environmental space is, you know, we do climate and environmental work every day, right? We're always doing this work. Now we're watching a film and we're not leaving with any sense of hope. Like, as people that are actively doing this work all the time, do you think that, and not everyone had that takeaway, but this is something that I heard happen quite a lot for environmentalists that are doing this work every day. So my question for you is, do you think that climate storytellers have a responsibility to integrate optimism or hope in their work? Is that a standard that we should set? Is that unrealistic?
So, I mean, I think that we have to remember that climate and environment, these are issues that will impact every, sector of human life in some capacity. And everyone has different personalities, everyone learns differently, and everyone is spurred into action for different reasons. Some people can see the most devastating, environmental documentary you've ever seen in your life. One person will feel hopeless and just never want to touch it again. And then one person will feel spurred by their anger and want to jump into action. Then you have the opposite, where, people might see something that's optimistic and, that might not really get them going, but say like, okay, that's cool, they got these solutions, that they're implementing, all right, whatever. And then some people see them, they're like, oh, there is hope for me to be able to help contribute and make a difference and get involved because we do have a chance. And so I think there's no one, I'm a solutions-based activist. I'm someone who's always, pushing for empowerment and for, the solutions and what we can do. But I also recognize that not everyone responds to the same thing. And I think as what Isaiah spoke to, that it needs to be carefully crafted, and I think that as long as we do zero in on the solutions, what can be done in the underserved issues, no matter what direction you take it in, people learn differently, respond differently, or spur into action differently, and that's a fact of human nature. So.
Right. And then last thing, just because I want to get some questions, is humor. Where does humor fall into all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say humor is so critical along with like climate solutions, and actually like a bunch of comedians made a video that like climate change can't be funny, but I think that's just because they don't know the climate science, if I'm being blunt about it. I think climate scientists are really funny. I think those of us talking about like doom and gloom, like, some of us are really good at like the existential humor, but some of us can make things funny, whether that's like doing a makeup tutorial gone wrong to teach people about feedback loops, or it's like, climate dating. I came up with a series called Love and Climate Change where I made people go on dates and be awkward and talk about sustainability. And anyways, humor is my MO on my page, and I really want there to be more of it.
Yes, I love that. I want more content about the climate dating. I'd pay to be a part of that. But any questions? Okay, over here.
Hi, guys. I have one question in this whole summit for you guys. Okay, so my question is this. We've talked a lot about you guys and the amazing work that you're doing, and the opportunities that you're looking to have within the community, outside of just social media and beyond. And as we all know, creating a film and television is very, very hard, and a lot of it has to do with the audience that you're delivering to. And the money that is given is based on the projections, the return of investment on the other side. So my question for you all of you is how do you create an audience that will allow for someone who's investing in a film or a television to feel confident that they will have a return in their investment on the projects that you are creating?
Wait, did you want to say something? I was just going to say, I think that, there need to be more climate IPs. There need to be more climate franchises. We have so many new media franchises and franchises that are being resurrected, every day. And I think that, we need to start building more, iconic media that also organically integrates, topics around sustainability and also we were kind of, talking about, is there room for various genres like comedy and like dating? Like, I want to see more, I want to see more of these storylines in rom-coms, in comedies, in dramas. I want a climate video game RPG, okay? Like, the possibilities are endless. This is something that touches all of us in some way. And so I think that really not narrowing your mindset on this type of storytelling will bring more opportunity and return on investment. That's my thought.
You know, the APA recently released a report that said that 3/4 of young people experience eco-anxiety, right? Like some sort of ecological grief about experiencing existential dread about the climate crisis in the future or already experiencing it. So I know, please wrap up. And the thing is, because we have this anxiety, there is this great need for climate stories that I think are integrating all these different things that we're talking about and are in that packaging creating different pathways to have optimism and have hope and to start understanding how solutions can be oriented in their lives and their own spheres of influence. So the need is there for sure. Yeah, I see 0, so.
Oh, okay.
That's okay. You can keep going.
Okay, is there another question? Yes.
So I'll just say, because I'm right here. So, Kristy, you mentioned earlier about how. Oh, great. Okay, so Kristy mentioned earlier about how, not to quote you verbatim, but you were saying something around the lines of brands needing to prioritize DE&I and some of these issues on top of prioritizing climate change. Can you please elaborate on that? Because it's something, just being in the world of social, I'm seeing more often. So I would love to continue to hear more about that from you. If that's
Sure.
okay.
And I can tie it back into the previous question also. I would just say that, like, there's so many more young people that want to see melanated people on screen talking about climate stuff. I don't know how else to say it. Like, there's so many people that tell me, they're like, yeah, we've been waiting to see a person of color talking about this. Like, we love all the science shows, we love these hosts, but we've been waiting. And I get that feedback all the time from people.
There are black and brown scientists.
And there's
Oh,
black and
yes.
brown climate scientists that don't even, anyways, that's a whole other thing. But I would just say that in terms of like the profitability, if we're talking in capitalist terms, I would say that like so many people want to see more diversity and inclusion in these spaces, regardless of the sector already. So when it comes to climate and sustainability, I think they especially want to see it because it shows that a company, again, is not only having these transparency indices around where they're sourcing their materials, but they're also talking about labor practices is what I want to specifically say. When I talk to brands, I actually have a brand scorecard. I actually ask them, I'm like, where do you source your materials and who makes your products? Because most people ask, where do you source your materials? They never ask who actually works in your factories. And what does your employee makeup look like? And what does your nonprofit board or your leadership team look like? I ask those questions. And they're like, oh my gosh, no one's ever asked us that. And I'm like, really? And it's just funny because they thought that they could just get along just being sustainable or eco-friendly because they mostly have only ever worked with like white zero-waste bloggers, which is fine. But I'm just saying, like, I'm not a white zero-waste blogger. So it's like, if you want to work with me, then these are X, Y, and Z metric you have to follow. And I think more brands are catching on that does make them more appealing. I think in terms of a studio wanting to support that work, again, I think coming from a cultural background that brings a new perspective and a new element, a new personality to the work adds a whole new dimension and lens of storytelling. And I think that would get more viewers. I think that would get more people to be interested because they're seeing someone who looks like them on screen. And we're seeing even in America, majority of people in America are going to be people of the global majority, people of color. And so it's like shows are gonna need to show that representation to remain relevant. So I would say that's my argument on why those of us deserve to have our own shows in media productions, because I'm like, if that's the return on investment, I think there's a strong desire from it is what we're seeing. So yeah.
But another point I have, to add to what Maya had said earlier, in regards to sometimes, like myself, I'm a filmmaker, and there's two of us, Roxana, and we partner and we produce film, and then we did it with the community. So we've had to reach out to funding within our community working on a Mason, you know, so that's documentary. So I can just only say that there's people that are waiting to hear our voices.
That's amazing.
And we support the white community, especially Tennessee.
Congratulations.
Congrats.
Another person to talk to.
Also launched the film festival, my first film festival. Yes.
That's awesome.
So Vida Burt Film Festival, so it is to amplify white voices because as you all were stating, we are not seeing enough of that.
And that speaks to how community driven this movement and this shift is. You're an amazing example of that.
Cool.
Wow.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.